Chapter 1, The Moment of Desperation. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon in Crestfield Park. Birds chirped lightly in the trees, their songs mixing with the soft rustling of leaves as a gentle breeze passed through the sprawling oak trees. Families enjoyed picnics, children chased one another with infectious laughter, and joggers kept their rhythmic pace along the winding paths. Amidst this idyllic scenery, no one could have foreseen the dramatic scene unfolding near the western edge of the park. Jerome Barnes, a 33-year-old wheelchair user, had planned for a brief escape into nature. His usual routine involved rolling down the park's smooth paths, taking in the sights, and listening to the sounds that offered solace from the city's relentless noise. But today, Jerome wasn't focused on relaxation. His mind was clouded with frustration, fear, and anger. An injustice had plagued his life for months, something he couldn't run from, something he had tried to fight in every legal way possible. And yet, no one listened. His head throbbed as he clenched his fists around the cold metal of his wheelchair. His breathing was labored, not just from the physical strain but from the emotional weight crushing him. He had been wrongfully accused of a crime, a theft he didn't commit. His life had spiraled out of control since the accusation. He lost his job, his dignity, and almost every ounce of hope he had. The police had arrived at the park that day, acting on a tip-off. Jerome had been tracked, followed, and now, as he sat alone near the towering oak tree, he noticed them approaching from a distance. 5 uniformed officers, moving quickly, their black and blue uniforms a stark contrast against the greenery. Jerome's heart pounded in his chest. They were here for him. He knew it. But for what? For existing. For trying to catch his breath after the whirlwind his life had become. As the officers reached him, Jerome raised his hands, trying to show compliance. "What is this about?" he asked, his voice trembling yet steady. "I haven't done anything." The officers, with stern faces, ignored his plea. They handcuffed him, tightening the cold metal around his wrists as he was lifted, helplessly, out of his wheelchair. He winced, not from the physical pain, but from the sheer helplessness of the moment. The officers surrounded him, their faces stoic, emotionless. His body trembled in the hands of the law, which had now become a weapon against him. "Why are you doing this?" Jerome asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. But none of the officers answered. The fear in his eyes turned to confusion, and soon, that confusion began to meld into anger. He had been through too much to endure this silent brutality. But what could he do? Chapter 2, A Man Unseen. Jerome wasn't always a man beaten down by life. In fact, not long ago, he had been a successful journalist, known for uncovering corruption in local businesses and advocating for the underserved in the community. His work was respected, and his name carried weight. But all of that changed when he began investigating a local politician, Darius Knowles. Darius was a rising star in the state legislature. Charismatic, wealthy, and seemingly untouchable. But Jerome knew there was something off about the man. Over the course of several months, he had dug deep into Darius's dealings, uncovering evidence of bribes, extortion, and backdoor deals that exploited the most vulnerable residents of the city. He was on the verge of publishing a career-defining expose when the unimaginable happened. It started small, strange phone calls in the middle of the night, threatening letters left on his doorstep. Then came the rumors, people whispering behind his back, his name suddenly tarnished in the very circles he once walked confidently through. The final blow came when he was accused of stealing from the very charity he had championed years ago. Evidence had been fabricated, twisted to paint Jerome as a villain. He had been framed, and he knew it was Darius's doing. Jerome fought back in court, but the system had no patience for the truth. He was convicted, his reputation shattered, and after serving a brief sentence, he returned home to find his career destroyed. He sought help from those who once considered him a friend, but doors were slammed in his face. Now, on the streets, Jerome was just another nameless man lost to the shadows of a corrupt system, his wheelchair acting as a cruel reminder of his imprisonment, both literal and figurative. Chapter 3, The weight of the past. The officers lifted Jerome from the wheelchair, but something in him snapped. This wasn't right. He knew he couldn't just let them take him like this again. His voice, once silenced by the weight of false accusations, began to rise. "You think this is justice?" he spat through gritted teeth. "I haven't done anything, and you know it." Officer McHale, the tallest of the group, tightened his grip on Jerome's wrist. "We have a warrant for your arrest. You can explain it later." Jerome's eyes burned into McHale's, searching for any hint of humanity, but he found none. "Later? How many times do I have to explain myself before someone actually listens?" His chest rose and fell rapidly as his anger escalated. "I've been explaining myself for years, and no one listens. You're all just part of the same damn machine, grinding people down." One of the younger officers, Officer Davis, shifted uncomfortably, his grip on Jerome loosening slightly. The words hit him in a place he didn't expect. This wasn't some hardened criminal they were dealing with. Jerome's eyes, filled with a mix of desperation and fury, told a different story. "You can file a complaint once we get to the station," McHale said, his voice cold, uninterested. He had seen too many men like Jerome, men who claimed they were innocent. It was always the same, and he wasn't going to let sentimentality cloud his judgment. The law was clear, and he was simply doing his job. Jerome gritted his teeth, his knuckles white as he clenched the armrests of his wheelchair. He knew this wasn't going to end in his favor, but he couldn't give up now. Not when he had lost so much already. Chapter 4, Resistance. As they began to push Jerome toward the police vehicle, his mind raced. Every fiber of his being screamed to fight back, to resist, but he was trapped by his physical limitations, by the system, by the overwhelming power of the men standing around him. "Stop!" Jerome shouted, his voice breaking through the air like a siren. People in the park turned their heads. A few joggers slowed their pace. Mothers watching their children play looked over in concern. But none of them moved. None of them came to his aid. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The officers looked around, realizing that they had become the center of attention. Jerome's outburst had drawn eyes, but for how long? Would anyone step in? Would anyone care? "What's the problem here?" a voice called from the crowd. A man in his mid-40s, dressed in a casual business suit, walked toward the scene. His expression was one of curiosity, but also concern. Jerome looked at him, pleading silently for intervention. The officers tightened their formation around Jerome, their grips becoming more forceful. "This is official police business," McHale said sternly. "Please move along, sir." But the man didn't move. He took a step closer. "What has he done?" "That's none of your concern," McHale replied, his voice growing irritated. "Step back or we'll have to." Before he could finish, Jerome spoke up. "They're arresting me for no reason. I haven't done anything wrong." The man hesitated. His eyes shifted from Jerome to the officers, weighing the situation. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the sound of police sirens in the distance cut him off. It was clear that the situation was escalating. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Officer Davis said, his voice tinged with a hint of sympathy. Jerome could see the conflict in the young officer's eyes. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to be a part of this. Chapter 5, A Chance for Hope. The sirens grew louder, and soon 2 more police cars pulled up to the scene. Jerome's heart sank. More officers meant less chance of escape, less chance of someone hearing his side of the story. The man in the business suit had backed away, blending into the crowd that was now dispersing, eager to avoid becoming part of the confrontation. As the new officers stepped out of their vehicles, one of them, a woman with short brown hair and sharp eyes, approached McHale. "What's going on here?" she asked, glancing between Jerome and the officers surrounding him. "Routine arrest," McHale replied. "We've got a warrant." The woman frowned, pulling a piece of paper from her pocket. "I need to see that warrant." McHale handed her the document, and for a moment, silence fell over the group as she read through it. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced at Jerome, then back at McHale. "This isn't right," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There's been a mistake." Jerome's breath caught in his throat. Was this it? Was this the moment someone finally listened? Mikhail's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The woman handed the warrant back to him. "This is an old warrant, from before his case was overturned. Jerome Barnes was cleared of these charges 2 weeks ago." Jerome's eyes widened. Could it be true? Could his nightmare finally be over? Chapter 6, The System's Error. The atmosphere shifted, tension lingering in the air as Mikhail scanned the warrant again. His face turned ashen as he read the fine print at the bottom. There it was, clear as day, Jerome's case had been overturned. Jerome could see Mikhail's frustration boiling underneath his stern expression, but this wasn't a time for pride. It was a time for justice. The female officer, Detective Andrea Wilson, looked at Mikhail and his team with an unwavering gaze. "We need to release him immediately. This arrest isn't valid anymore." Jerome's heart pounded in his chest as her words sank in. Was this the moment he'd been praying for? For months, he had fought for his innocence, shouted his truth to anyone who would listen, and yet the system continued to crush him under its relentless weight. This was the first time anyone in authority had truly seen him. Mikhail's jaw clenched as he gestured for the younger officers to release Jerome from the handcuffs. As they worked to unlock him, Jerome could feel the cold metal loosen, the tight grip of injustice beginning to slip away, but the damage had already been done. Jerome rubbed his raw wrists, trying to process the reality of the situation. Yes, he was free from this immediate arrest, but what about the months of torment, the years of his life lost to false accusations? What about his reputation, his career, his name? The wheels of justice had finally turned in his favor, but the scars they left behind would take a lifetime to heal. "Mr. Barnes, I'm sorry for this mistake," Detective Wilson said, stepping forward. Her voice carried genuine regret. "We'll get this sorted. I'll personally make sure everything is cleared with the department." Jerome looked into her eyes, searching for sincerity. For the first time in a long time, he saw it, a flicker of hope in the midst of his darkness. Chapter 7, A lifetime of battle. As the officers dispersed and the crowd slowly faded back into their day, Jerome found himself alone again. The bustling park had returned to its peaceful state, but Jerome's mind was anything but calm. He wheeled himself toward a bench, sitting in silence as the events of the day played over and over in his mind. That it wasn't the first time he had been wrongfully targeted, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. The systemic prejudice he faced as a black man and a person with disabilities had plagued his life for as long as he could remember. Today's arrest was just another chapter in a long book of discrimination. As he sat, staring out at the vast green space in front of him, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his lawyer, Maya. She had been working tirelessly to clear his name, to right the wrongs that had been done to him. Her texts were brief, but they carried weight. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" Jerome sighed, typing back a quick response. "I'm out. But they almost got me again." Moments later, his phone rang, and Maya's concerned voice filled his ear. "Jerome, this can't keep happening. We need to do something more. You can't live your life constantly looking over your shoulder." "I know," Jerome replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But what can I do? Every time I think I'm free, they find a way to pull me back in." Maya's voice softened. "We'll keep fighting. But I think it's time we take this to the media. Your story needs to be told. People need to know what's happening to you." Jerome was silent for a moment, contemplating the weight of her words. He had been a journalist once, the one telling other people's stories, shining a light on corruption and injustice. But now, it was his own life that had become a headline. Could he really handle that kind of exposure? Did he want to? "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Jerome admitted. "I don't want to be another story people forget about in a week." "This won't be forgotten," Maya said firmly. "You're not just another story, Jerome. You're a symbol of everything that's wrong with the system. We can change things, together. Jerome closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had been fighting for so long, and the thought of going public terrified him. But what choice did he have? If he stayed silent, the system would continue to crush people like him. If he spoke up, maybe, just maybe, he could spark the change he had spent his career advocating for. "All right," Jerome said finally. "Let's do it. Let's tell the world." Chapter 8, The Price of Truth. A week later, Jerome found himself sitting in front of a camera, bright lights shining down on him as a reporter asked him about the arrest in the park. The interview had been arranged by Maya, and she sat just off camera, offering him silent support. Jerome's hands shook as he spoke, recounting not just the events of the park, but the months of hell he had been through. He told them about the investigation into Darius Knowles, the fabricated charges, the trial that tore his life apart, and the years he spent trying to rebuild what had been taken from him. The reporter listened intently, her eyes filled with sympathy as Jerome poured his heart out. But Jerome knew that sympathy wasn't enough. He needed action, he needed people to stand up and say, "No more." The interview aired that evening, and by the next morning, Jerome's story had gone viral. Social media erupted with outrage, people demanding justice for Jerome, calling for investigations into the police department, and questioning how a man could be wrongfully arrested twice for a crime he didn't commit. But with the support came the backlash. Jerome's inbox was flooded with hate mail, people calling him a liar, a fraud, and worse. Darius Knowles' supporters came out in full force, painting Jerome as a man seeking attention, desperate for fame. Jerome had expected the backlash, but it didn't make it any easier. He had spent his life uncovering the truth, and now, he was the one being scrutinized. Chapter 9, A Turning Tide. Despite the vitriol, Jerome's story continued to gain momentum. Protests were held outside the police department, demanding accountability for the wrongful arrest. Detective Wilson, the officer who had intervened at the park, became a key witness, providing testimony about the outdated warrant and the systemic failures within the department. The district attorney's office launched an internal investigation, and soon, heads began to roll. Officers who had mishandled Jerome's case were placed on administrative leave, and McHale, who had spearheaded the arrest, resigned under pressure. But the biggest victory came when Darius Knowles was finally brought to justice. A whistleblower within his campaign came forward, providing irrefutable evidence of the corruption Jerome had been investigating all along. Darius was arrested, and Jerome's name was finally cleared in the public eye. For the first time in years, Jerome felt like he could breathe again. The weight that had been crushing him was starting to lift. Chapter 10, Moving forward. Months passed, and Jerome found himself in a new chapter of his life. The media attention had faded, and though his story had sparked change, Jerome knew the fight wasn't over. There were still so many people like him, trapped in the system, their voices silenced. But Jerome wasn't silenced anymore. With Maya's help, he had started an organization dedicated to fighting wrongful convictions and advocating for police reform. He traveled across the country, speaking at rallies and events, sharing his story and encouraging others to come forward. The pain of his past would never fully disappear, but Jerome had found a new purpose. His life had been defined by injustice, but now, he was helping others find their own justice. As he wheeled himself into a courtroom one last time, this time as an advocate for another wrongfully accused man, Jerome knew that his fight had just begun. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Chapter 11, Echoes of Change. The courtroom was silent, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside Jerome. He sat at the front, representing the young man, Kevin Brown, whose life had been shattered in ways eerily similar to his own. Kevin, barely 24, had been wrongfully accused of assault, the evidence against him flimsy at best, but the system had moved swiftly, already branding him a criminal before he could even mount a proper defense. Jerome listened intently as Kevin's public defender outlined the defense's case, but the reality of the situation weighed heavily on him. Kevin's family, sitting in the gallery behind him, looked broken, their eyes pleading for justice they had almost given up on finding. It was all too familiar. As Jerome took in the scene, he felt a deep sense of responsibility, not just to Kevin, but to all the people who had been failed by the system. He hadn't set out to become an advocate, but fate had placed him in this position. The scars of his past now served as his armor, and he was determined to use his experiences to ensure others didn't suffer the same fate. When the defense attorney finished, Jerome's eyes locked with Kevin's for a brief moment. In that glance, they shared something unspoken, a bond forged in the fire of injustice. Kevin's eyes were wide with fear, but there was also a glimmer of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, Jerome could make a difference. Chapter 12. The battle ahead. After the court proceedings, Jerome wheeled himself out of the courthouse, the weight of the case pressing down on his shoulders. Maya met him at the bottom of the steps, her face full of understanding and concern. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. Jerome shook his head slightly. "It's tough, Maya. The evidence is weak, but the prosecution is pushing hard. They want to make an example out of Kevin. It's the same story all over again." Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll fight it, like we always do. You're doing good work, Jerome. You're changing lives." Jerome exhaled, glancing at the people passing by. "I know. But it's never enough, is it? For every Kevin, there are 10 more out there, lost in the system. It feels like we're fighting an uphill battle every single day." Maya knelt down beside his wheelchair, her hand resting gently on his arm. "I believe in what we're doing. And so do all the people you've helped. Don't lose sight of that." Jerome offered a small, weary smile. "You're right. Sometimes I wonder if we're making the kind of change that sticks. If it's enough." Maya's expression softened. "You've already changed lives, Jerome. Don't forget that." Chapter 13. A rally for justice. Weeks passed, and Jerome's case for Kevin Brown began gaining traction. Word spread through advocacy circles, and soon, people from all over the city were rallying for Kevin's freedom. Jerome stood before a crowd one evening, looking out over hundreds of faces holding signs, chanting for change. It was a surreal experience. Once a journalist, a storyteller for others, now his own life had become a story that ignited a movement. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all those who had been silenced, beaten down, and left behind by the justice system. As Jerome prepared to address the crowd, he couldn't help but reflect on the strange twists of fate that had brought him here. He had once dreamed of a peaceful life, a career in journalism, a stable existence where he could advocate for others from behind the safety of his words. Now, he was at the forefront of a fight that was far bigger than himself. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Jerome began, his voice amplified by the microphone. The crowd quieted, their attention fixated on him. "When I was first accused of a crime I didn't commit, I thought my life was over. I thought that was it, that the system had won, that I had no future left. But I'm standing here today because I refuse to let that injustice define me. And Kevin Brown deserves the same chance." A cheer rose from the crowd, and Jerome paused to let it settle before continuing. "We're here because we believe in something bigger. We believe in justice, real justice. Not the kind that punishes the innocent while letting the guilty walk free. We're here to demand change, to demand accountability, and to ensure that no one else has to suffer through what Kevin, and so many others, have endured." The crowd roared in agreement, and for the first time in weeks, Jerome felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but at that moment, surrounded by people who shared his vision for a better future, he felt like real change was possible. Chapter 14. Kevin's verdict. The trial came faster than Jerome had expected. For weeks, he had worked with Kevin's lawyer, combing through the details of the case, finding witnesses, and exposing the inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence. The system was stacked against them, as it always seemed to be, but Jerome was relentless. He had been through this once before, and he knew the fight they were up against. Kevin sat at the defense table, his hands trembling as the jury filed back into the courtroom. Jerome sat behind him, silently praying for a verdict that would finally right the wrongs that had been done. He knew the stakes. If Kevin was found guilty, his life would be destroyed, just like Jerome's had been. The foreman stood, holding the piece of paper that contained Kevin's fate. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. We, the jury, find the defendant, not guilty. A collective gasp filled the courtroom, and Kevin collapsed in relief. Jerome felt tears sting his eyes as he watched Kevin's family rush to embrace him. For the first time in months, Kevin was free from the false accusations, free from the chains that had threatened to steal his future, but the victory was bittersweet. Jerome knew that while Kevin had been spared, there were still countless others who wouldn't be so lucky. The fight was far from over. Chapter 15, a new beginning. In the weeks following Kevin's acquittal, Jerome's organization, the Barnes Foundation for Justice, gained national attention. Donations poured in, and Jerome found himself on the front lines of a growing movement for criminal justice reform. He was invited to speak at universities, to meet with lawmakers, to advocate for systemic change at the highest levels, but for Jerome, the work was never about fame or recognition. It was about people, real people, like Kevin, who had been forgotten by a system designed to protect them. And though he still bore the scars of his own battles, Jerome knew that he was stronger for them. One evening, as he sat in his office, Jerome received a call. It was Maya. "I have good news," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Darius Knowles was just sentenced. He's going away for a long time." Jerome leaned back in his chair, the weight of the news settling over him like a warm blanket. Darius Knowles, the man who had started it all, who had destroyed Jerome's life, was finally facing justice. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. "Thank you, Maya," Jerome said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Maya chuckled softly. "You did this, Jerome. You fought back. And look at what you've accomplished." Jerome looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a long time, Jerome felt at peace. He had found his purpose, and with that purpose came a quiet strength that could not be taken from him. "I couldn't have done it without you," Jerome said softly. Maya's voice was warm on the other end. "We're just getting started."